Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Bo Donnelly, Dean of the Creighton University School of Medicine. We're going to have a panel discussion this afternoon, but as is our custom, we're going to begin with a brief reflection. And tonight I chose the peace prayer of St. Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. As we begin this special panel discussion this evening, I want to make a couple of points, and then I want to turn over to our experts. First of all, we believe that every human being is a gift from God, and because of that, everybody deserves dignity and respect. Second of all, the reason Creighton University exists is to help every human being achieve their God-given potential. Things that impede the achievement of that potential are what we work to correct. The topic of this evening's conversation is going to be racism, which was a contentious subject long before this country was founded. And we're going to have a conversation today about, reflecting on where we are and maybe talking about what needs to be done to move things ahead. As is almost always the case with difficult subjects, if we're going to have honest, heartfelt dialogue, there's going to be some discomfort. And I think we have to recognize that that discomfort is part of a growing experience for all of us. And we have to embrace that as we move ahead. We're responsible for helping create the world in the image that God wanted. This evening's panelists include Dr. Brittany Bell, who's in the Creighton University School of Medicine graduate. Now she's a second-year medicine resident at the Phoenix campus. She was one of the founding members of the Diversity Inclusion Committee on the Phoenix campus and has participated in a lot of projects as the Creighton Idea Scholar, a pipeline program designed to recruit high school students to careers in healthcare. She's also been an avid researcher with a focus on healthcare disparities. So welcome, Dr. Bell. Father Clifton is Associate Dean for Mission Identity in the Creighton University School of Medicine. He has spent much of his career working as a hospital chaplain and directing inpatient pastoral care. He also served as a pastor of St. Francis Cabrini in Omaha for many years. Dr. Ronn Johnson is a professor of psychiatry as well as Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the Creighton University School of Medicine. He's the lead clinical psychologist at the mental health clinic at the Nebraska Western VA healthcare system. He's done forensic work with over 40 law enforcement agencies across the country, including Boston, Los Angeles, Chicago, and the California Department of Corrections. He's published articles on anti-terrorism, corrections, police, and forensic psychology, and has presented many times on this subject. Dr. Claudia Chambers is a native of Toronto, Canada, completed her undergraduate degree and Bachelor of Science of Biology at McMaster University, and then graduated from SUNY Upstate and completed a residency in OBGYN at Boston University. She recently completed an MBA with a healthcare emphasis at Baylor University. She's been a faculty physician for over 18 years, and before coming to St. Joseph Hospital in Phoenix, she was a faculty physician at the University of Michigan. She's currently chair of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology for the Dignity Health Medical Group. She also serves as the Assistant Dean of Admissions and has an associate professorship in the school. And finally, our moderator, Dr. Tom Spolos, is a professor of psychiatry at the Omaha campus and Associate Dean for Strategy and Accreditation. He is a practicing Lacanian psychoanalyst and a member of the World Association of Psychoanalysis. For many years, he served as the psychiatry consult liaison at Bergen Mercy Hospital, and he's also chair of the psychiatry department in the School of Medicine. He's an active speaker internationally. His articles have appeared in 9 languages, and he recently published a book, 21st Century Psychoanalysis. I'll turn the program over to Dr. Savalos.
Thank you, Dr. Dunley. I just want to make a couple very brief announcements about the format here. We will have 4 speakers. Excuse me. I want to make a couple announcements about the format here. We will have 4 speakers who will be presenting remarks that will go on for about 40 minutes or so. After the 4 speakers have presented the remarks, they will be interested in taking your questions or responding to your comments, and there will be time for a Q&A session. You'll notice at the bottom of the screen there's a chat function in Zoom. Just enter your question or comment as the speakers are presenting, and Jason Bartz, our colleague, a professor of medical microbiology and Associate Dean for Academic and Faculty Affairs, will be gathering and assembling the questions and then posing them to the panelists for the Q&A portion of the session. With that with those introductory comments complete, I'll go ahead and turn the microphone over to Ron Johnson, who will be our first presenter.
Hello, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you during a pivotal time in our country's history. It's an honor. First and foremost, I want to extend my prayers and condolences to the Floyd family, who are enduring an unimaginable grief and trauma watching a video of a loved one as they're being killed in the hands of police, and the daily traumatic reminders of it. Before I begin painting the picture of so many are trying to illustrate to our nation, I'd like to share a personal connection I have to this moment. No, I'm not going to talk to you about my experience as a Black man in a predominantly white profession. I'm not going to tell you about my upbringing in one of the roughest and poorest neighborhoods in Chicago. I'm not going to even talk about how, as a child, I fully believed the only white people on earth were the ones on television. I'm going to share with you my experience of being enlisted to shift the policing culture in one of the most racially divisive parts of the country, Selma, Alabama. A critical piece of Alabama's history includes Bloody Sunday, upon which hundreds of demonstrators were brutally beaten by Alabama state troopers as they attempted to march along the Pettus Bridge connecting Selma to Montgomery in the name of voting equality. Alabama state troopers had a pretty poor track record regarding race relations, justice, and representation within their ranks. Alabama took a step toward reversing systemic oppression with the issuance of a consent decree racially integrating the state troopers, including hiring adjustments and reversing racial discriminatory practices. As a result, the Department of Justice ordered 1 qualified African-American trooper be hired for every white trooper until the force was 25% Black. This case was later upheld at the U.S. Supreme Court, supporting the controversial affirmative action remedy. The Alabama State Troopers hired me to conduct its forensic psychological evaluations for the applicants, for which I needed to travel to Alabama. My mother, well-versed in the potential dangers of this trip, used the ultimate mother card, telling me, if you love me, you won't go. I made the difficult decision to take the trip, but I promised to call her long distance every night to check in. On my flight, I was seated next to an elderly Black couple who I told I was traveling to their hometown of Selma. They were shocked when I declined their offer for a ride, telling them an Alabama state trooper would be waiting for me at the gate and would drive me. I'm certain I blew their minds when they saw me first, likely the first time they'd ever seen a Black forensic psychologist in their entire life, much less heard of, driving away in front seat of a state trooper vehicle, chauffeured by a broad-shouldered Southern officer. Despite my own biases, I did the forensic work, listening, learning, and advising. The case finally ended in 1995, more than 23 years after it began, and the Alabama State Troopers have gone from a symbol of oppression to evidence of successful integration, with the highest percentage of minority officers in the nation. I assure you it can be done. Now forget about the peaceful protesters, the anarchists, the white supremacists who are all out in force now. Do not allow anything to overshadow the fact that another unarmed black man was murdered by police. George Floyd and onlookers begged for his life, with no impact on the actions of these former police officers. George Floyd was confronted and pinned by police after being accused of using a counterfeit $20 bill. Nearly 6 years earlier, Eric Gardner was killed for selling cigarettes on the street. Data tells us that Black Americans are 2.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police. This is a grave injustice, and it's a direct attack on our nation's founding principles. Please understand, I get that it's hard to stand up, to speak out, to show your solidarity at this time. Don't think for a second that people of color have missed the deafening silence, tepid response, and attempts to dilute the significance of our nation's long documented history of racism. Silence, a need to play the devil's advocate, and superficial allyship without action is no longer acceptable. Now is the time to loudly promote justice for all. We've not reckoned with the racial history of our country. It's almost inconceivable that in 2020, with mind-boggling technological advances and infinite access to information, Black people will still be marginalized, menaced, targeted, and murdered. Historically, law enforcement was a catalyst to sustain the narrative that Black people are less than and undeserving of fair treatment. What resulted was Black people being terrorized and killed during the Reconstruction era following the Civil War. And this seamlessly has continued today in policing. Policing has a well-documented trail of race-conscious behavior and served as a visible force of opposition to racial integration during the 1950s and 1960s. Paradoxically, it's the only profession in which the erosion of its legitimacy and procedural justice actually compromises the very safety of its officers. Time for a gut check. If you can only see these senseless killings and unjust policing as Black issue, then your mindset reveals a larger collective consciousness problem. From the theft of land from Native Americans in Tennessee, followed by the death-filled forced relocation, and later the internment of Japanese, racial injustice is unfortunately a defining feature of our country's policing. Before criticizing looting and vandalism, which I do not support, please familiarize yourself with what the country's original looters did with displaced Japanese and Native American property. Thousands died under horrible medical circumstances as a result of these actions. Today, racism is the greatest factor for healthcare disparity in this country. This public health crisis with layers of inequality that affects us all. Just this year, 2 white convicted felons were released from prison for home confinement over concern that they would contract COVID-19. At a cursory glance, this seems somewhat understandable. However, we must ask ourselves 2 critical follow-up questions. Given that Blacks are commonly known to be more susceptible to contracting the virus, how many Black felons were released from prison for the same reason? We already know the answer. Closer to home, Omaha was the site of a race riot just over 100 years ago when a Black man named Will Brown was lynched, mutilated, and burned. That history affects us all. Black Americans are experiencing and voicing the accumulation of generations of anger. Personally, I must constantly navigate racism as well as the nation's resistance to doing much about it and sustaining it through policing. It's well known by my closest friends and family that given the opportunity, I would quit my job today to become a film critic if I could. So please indulge me with a film analogy on policing, racism, and Black Americans. One of my favorite films in the last few years is the film called The Revenant. If you haven't seen it, do yourself a favor and check it out. I specifically recall a disturbing scene depicting Hugh Glass, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. He was being brutally attacked. Glass gets mauled by a ferocious grizzly bear and is hurt so badly he appears to play dead at several points. The grizzly bear, though, is unrelenting. Glass realizes that for any hope or survival, he now needs to he cannot rely on the kindness of the bear. His survival depended on taking the offensive before it was too late. He finally retrieves his knife and manages to kill the bear despite his near fatal wounds. In the eyes of some ethno-racial groups, law enforcement is the grizzly bear, mauling their communities, while at the same time asking the community to blindly rely on its kindness or justice. It's not hard to see that this request seems almost comical and why many in the groups refer to justice pejoratively as just us. Here are some sobering statistics to back up this perspective. 1 in every 1,000 Black men can expect to be killed by police. In 2019, police shot and killed 1,004 people, and about 1/4 of those people were Black. So now that we have a better understanding of the current ecosystem, can we make it better? Is anti-racist or equitable policing possible? What does equitable law enforcement look like? Part of the answer requires a shift in the culture of police training to better allow for protecting and serving as opposed to shooting or using excessive force. As I speak to you, our nation is confronted by a triple crisis: COVID-19, the excessive use of force and murder of Black civilians by law enforcement. Finally, and more tragically, there is a crisis in leadership. If you hear nothing else today, please hear this. I believe in the power of the community, hope, and responsibility. I invite you, I encourage you to stand boldly and let your voice be heard. Please take action, even if you're afraid. You must act to address racism where it occurs in the areas where you have expertise and opportunity. Do the hard, intentional work it takes to understand. Listen, read, challenge yourself, be better. In order to stand with us, you must work to understand. Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Johnson for his remarks. Again, I want to remind our attendees that if you have comments or questions that you would like Dr. Johnson and the other panelists to address during the Q&A portion of this event, please enter them into Zoom using the chat function, and we will get to them. Our next speaker will be Father Clifton, and we'll turn the microphone over to Father Clifton.
Thanks, Dr. Savolos, and thanks to all who are attending. It probably won't surprise you that I will place my remarks in the context of sin and grace, the struggle between good and evil in the world, and our individual response to that and our social response to that. There is before us a powerful expression of social sin, and yet it's made up of and strengthened by the contribution of our individual sin in the face of this. And so I'm going to turn to the simple things, the fundamental things, the things that will orient me toward doing the hard work that Dr. Johnson talked about. So that starting point, embracing one another as sisters and brothers, it's rooted in our mission as Creighton. It's rooted in faith for so many of us individually and all the world's great faiths. And how we're doing in this is a measure of the authenticity of our mission collectively and the measure of the authenticity of our personal faith, I think. If I believe that we're created in the image and likeness of God, that each of us is a unique and irreplaceable reflection of the greatness and diversity of God, that our value and worth, our dignity, depends utterly and entirely upon that fact and does not accrue to some accidental characteristic or feature, Our dignity is intrinsic and is rooted in the fact that each of us belongs to God, that our lives are entrusted to us and don't belong to us, that we are not masters of the universe, but servants, that we depend utterly and completely upon God to help us understand who we are and what we're for and what brings life and what leads to destruction for ourselves personally and for our humanity shared. You know, we talk about this in orientation with each incoming M1 class. And all of us say, oh yes, I believe in the dignity of the human person. I want to attend to and respect the dignity of each person that I'll encounter. My peers, family members, strangers, every patient, certainly. And yet this is an enormously difficult task, challenging beyond measure. And we'll talk more as we go along about what that means. If we believe, or if I believe, that our principal orientation in life is to praise, reverence, and serve God, as St. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuit order, insists, if I believe that we are incomplete in and of ourselves, that we're not the final judge of anyone, that we're not masters of the universe, if we believe that our understanding of God is incomplete without embracing the unique reflection of God found in each and every person we encounter, if we believe that every human being I will ever meet reveals something precious about humanity itself, about my humanity, about God, if I believe that the great Exodus was God rescuing his people from enslavement and challenging them never to forget that experience, to remember what it felt like, what it was to be enslaved, so that they could use that as the springboard, the wellspring of solidarity and compassion for all others who suffer in any kind of way, to let it be the source of our mission to set captives free. If I believe that God's love for each of us is so urgent and self-sacrificing that God sent his only Son to embrace our humanity, to pitch his tent among us, to identify with us in solidarity and compassion and mercy, who came not to be impressed by what I consider my virtue and my accomplishment, my worthiness, but to rescue me from slavery when I had no way out, on my own power, under our own power. To kneel down and wash our feet when we were not worthy. If I believe that Jesus came to establish his Father's kingdom, of which I am a subject and a servant, and that he did not send me to establish my own kingdom and to misuse my power, what little there is, to hold others in oppression, but rather to use it to liberate, always and everywhere. If I believe that cura personalis in our Creighton Ignatian tradition means something, that I want to dedicate myself to respecting the dignity of every person I encounter, then those things are a lot harder and more profound than I will ever exhaust in my entire lifetime. That listening to others and imagining that there is a worldview different than mine, that another person will always be something of a mystery to me as much as I can, wonderfully can, come to understand them. And that I need to hunger and thirst for understanding why they say the things they do, why they make the decisions that they make. Because so often there is experience and events and attitudes and the way others have encountered them that shape those things. If I believe those things and more, then I must dedicate myself to coming home to the real power of what those things mean, to conversion, to being taught, to having the humility to ask others to help me understand and to guide me toward what I should do. It's striking in the gospel passages that Jesus, encountering a blind man, still says to him, "What would you have me do for you?" It's the dignity of that man and what is most important to him that Jesus is attending to there. I need to ask, what is it that I can do? And have the humility to let what matters to another be powerful for me. In the Second Vatican Council, some stirring and beautiful words that the joys and the hopes, the sufferings and the griefs of the people of our age, these two are the joys and hopes, the sufferings and the griefs of the followers of Christ. Beautiful words, inspiring words, too often just on a poster. Do I mean that? Can I authenticate that in my life by letting those words be powerfully true again and again and again in the littlest and the largest ways? By letting those things, the sufferings and the victories of others, resonate in me, that I think of myself as part of us, and that any suffering has to affect me. Chesterton, almost seemingly, maybe just an overstatement for literary purpose, said that the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. I'd like that not to be true. There is much to celebrate in the history of the human family. And in fact, progress has been made, and some moments are better. I think of the noble moments in Jesuit history, for example, when the Jesuits stood with the native peoples, the indigenous peoples of the Andean mountain regions, who were being enslaved and slaughtered for the sake of the natural resources that they guarded, really, and established the reductions, the reducciones, the missions that were at the heart of the movie The Mission. The Jesuits aligned themselves so closely with those indigenous people that later on, in retribution, retaliation, we were suppressed by the great powers of Europe. It's costly to do what we must do. There are moments again and again through history. I think of William and John Marco, Jesuits here in Omaha, who in the late 50s and early 60s stood with those who were making known the terrible violence, the segregation of this city. And they paid a price, the university paid a price. It was unpopular with the powerful. But do I believe these things or not? Yes, it's difficult, but it must be tried. So we must be those who try anew with every bit of our strength. For yes, the road is difficult, but it's only possible together. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Father Clifton for his remarks. A reminder again for our attendees, please go ahead and enter any comments or questions using the chat function that will be addressed in the Q&A session, or at least we'll try to address as many as we can. Our next speaker will be Dr. Claudia Chambers, joining us from Phoenix.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to start by also, like Ron, giving my heartfelt condolences to the Floyd family. I come to this table actually somewhat apprehensive when we when I was asked to speak about this issue, I felt like it was something that I wasn't sure I would be able to speak to without feeling somewhat emotional about the experience. But I felt it was necessary because I do think we all see this from a different lens, and everybody's perspective is valuable. So I see this as through the lens of my history and my current experience and who I am today. And so I share with you that my lens looks different because my family ancestry is from the West Indies. I was born in Canada. I have been living here 25 years. And additionally, I have a brother who is Black and a son who's biracial. So when we talk about the uncomfortable conversations, I have them every day. I am a mother, I am a sister. I understand the challenges that Black men are having in this country and that racism is bringing to the forefront for so many of our loved ones. But we are not a homogenous group, and this is not a monolithic group. And I think that when we talk about the solutions, we have to talk about how it looks different for each of us. We have more than an issue of racism in this country. And I say that because as I talk about how I frame my vision of the world, the one thing that I didn't speak to that should be the first thing that I should have said actually was my faith. As a believer, everything I see through the mirror or the glasses of faith. And so my understanding of the world may look different than most because I understand that we're really looking at a crisis of humanity. How we treat one another, the dehumanization of other people is a hard issue. And in order for us to look at solutions, we really have to look at the heart. Having lived here 25 years, one of the things I am probably most frustrated with is the fact that I feel like we're still having the same conversation 25 years later. I think the truth be told is we need to have those hard conversations that we've not been willing to have. We need to be willing to hear the brokenness of those who have suffered the racism, but we also need to be able to hear those who feel frustrated and overwhelmed that they don't know how to support change. When I see protesters in the street, I know we've had some progress because I know that when I look at them, it's not just one group of people. I see everybody on the streets protesting, white, Black, and indifferent. And that speaks to my heart that maybe we're not where we need to be, but we've come further, but the dialogue hasn't moved any further. And so I think it's important that we start looking at real solutions. And those real solutions come from having those hard conversations. That's the part that I think most of us are not willing to do. I think the hard conversations really come down to saying things like why, the why, and getting to the real why behind why we're seeing these awful experiences over and over and over again. And recognizing that the only way to get past the why is to really look at building relationships and relationships that will have lasting impact. As a believer, I really only feel like there's two options in this: forgiveness and repentance. And I think at the end of the day, that both of those are called for in these conversations. And as we move forward, looking for real world solutions for how to heal our communities and how to heal those who've been broken as a result of these experiences. It is hard to point a finger at just the police or just the communities that have failed. The truth be told is we just have not taken the time to do the hard work to fix the brokenness in this country. And I think it's time to do so. Thank you for your time.
I want to thank Dr. Chambers for her remarks, and our next and final panelist speaker is Dr. Brittany Bell. I'll turn the microphone over to Dr. Bell.
Firstly, thank you so much for allowing me to speak here on this specific platform. I'm both honored and humbled just to be able to have this opportunity. I'd also like to echo what was previously said in giving my deepest condolences to the family and friends of George Floyd and all those that are grieving from the travesty of his death. While I am most grateful to be speaking, I do indeed realize that my perspective does not reflect the emotions of an entire group of individuals, and that during these times there are multitude of events that take place. They're occurring in our nation, and they're not limited to the pandemic, and they're inflicting extraordinary level of pain on our citizens. It is my desire that my words here be used to not exacerbate this pain, but to express my heart and motivation to work towards an environment of alleviation. One of my favorite presidents, John F. Kennedy, called for all members of society to be engaged in recent events by saying, "This nation, our nation, was founded on the principles that all men are created equal and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened." The killing of George Floyd at the hand of police brutality, unfortunately, gives us yet another reason to discuss racism in this country. While his death was neither the first nor the last this month or even this year, it does indeed highlight the murder of civilians by police enforcement. Myself, as an African-American female physician, I find myself in a position surrounded by a whirlwind of emotions, including fear, frustration, and anxiety. Yet simultaneously, I have been pleasantly surprised at the overwhelming responses to this horrific event across the nation. I have seen unification where I expected to see division, with voices from not just the Black community echoing these emotions. So for this reason, I am encouraged. I am encouraged with these voices. With this awareness, I have to give you my thoughts on this specific occurrence. I hope that we can have significant change. Former President Barack Obama phrased this perfectly. He stated, "I think that change can happen, typically not because somebody on high decides that it's going to happen, but rather because at a grassroots level, enough people come together, that they force the system to change. And that is why I am encouraged at this specific time." There are many areas where systemic racism affects our communities, but it's my passion to see this change in healthcare as a physician. Discussions are difficult, as iterated before, and they're uncomfortable, but they're necessary in order to even make such a change. As an internal medicine resident, I personally would advocate for support and platforms that allow residents, not just the Black ones, to speak up on their experiences and emotions during this time, and advocate for an increased education on both national and local healthcare disparities, as well as acknowledge social determinants of health. Often, unfortunately, my fellow residents and medical students have told me that they have been recipients of microaggressions and other racial slurs. These are intolerable in any setting, yet alone in a medical education setting, in an environment where we're supposed to be facilitating such change. I have been thinking quite long about specific changes that we can do as a medical community and as education going forward in this specific dominion. Ways to achieve this are exemplified in one area that is a passion and very dear to my heart, the Health Sciences, Multicultural, and Community Affairs Office on the Omaha campus, where I had the privilege of getting my post-baccalaureate. This department is headed by Dr. Kasoka Lasaki and her team. They provide students and residents with the necessary support needed to become a successful provider in this environment. Not only do they provide us with the academic resources to assist in obtaining a tremendous education, they also provide a unique space that both cultivates discussions on race and serve as a liaison to proactively deal with racism around us. Additionally, medical education programs must not only create these spaces within their institutions, such as is available in HS MACA, but they must also provide minority representation. Although the LCME does require diversity among their faculty and staff, this should not be the motivation behind doing so. This representation of minority and diversity on their staff and faculty members is not only important for the support of students and residents, but additionally in instilling the desire to optimize the care of our patients by forcing this education to include factors that influences access to care from our patients. I know these are large changes, and honestly, to start, they require small starts. But as physicians, we daily strive for excellence, not just in treating our patients, but when we are embracing our colleagues and influencing our society. While we have come a long way, I personally think we have much to do. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the time is always right to do something right, and that time is right now. So as we move forward on this path to do something right, I am eager for continued discussions amongst the healthcare community and the community outside the hospital walls. I'm hopeful for change and motivated to continue to use my voice. So for this reason, I want to express my gratitude to those here at Creighton University that made the space for me to use my voice, to have a discussion that is difficult and uncomfortable. Thank you again to all those who continue to fight for justice so that we may have a better world and that I can continue to speak as this.
I want to thank Dr. Bell for her presentation and thank all four of our presenters for very, I think, heartfelt, very individual and responses to the Floyd shooting and pointing some directions maybe for what we as healthcare professionals and future healthcare professionals need to be doing. I'm going to turn the microphone now over to our other moderator, Dr. Jason Bartz, who will take some of the questions and comments that we've received through the chat function and present them to the panelists for some additional remarks and discussion.
Thank you, Tom. First of all, I'd like to thank all the speakers for their powerful messages. I'd also like to acknowledge the thoughtful questions and comments from the many participants. So the first question, and this is directed towards Father Clifton, but of course all the panelists can comment. We have seen great support from church leadership and citizens to provide medical and emotional support at peaceful protests. When we see national leadership as unsupportive, what is the responsibility of large voices in faith circles, such as Creighton University, in stepping up and filling the void where leadership should be?
Yes. You know, this is a time for every organization to exercise moral leadership. And yet I think that we also have to be compassionate with folks' struggles to know what to say. You know, I want to separate this into two things: the practical help in some fashion, noble as it is and self-sacrificing as it is, it's easier when one sort of goes to speak for some place like Creighton or any individual church or a collection of churches. As much as I agree that this is exactly the time for that kind of moral leadership, I also recognize that it's difficult for folks. But I do want to point to people throughout the country, from religious organizations and otherwise, from the AAMC and so on, who have made really strong statements to inspire us and to challenge us and to guide us. It's a great question.
Okay, thank you, Father. So the next question, and this is directed towards Dr. Johnson, but again, anyone can respond if they choose. What advice would you give to the Minneapolis Police Department to move forward in the next months to years to change culture?
It's very tough, but if you use the lessons that were learned in Ferguson, one of the things that they did right away after things started breaking down was they brought in a state trooper, in Missouri State Trooper, and his name happened to be Ron Johnson, no relation. But one of the things that this captain had was credibility with the community, and was able to go in and kind of quell some of the issues in terms of the public safety components in a way that did not antagonize the community any further than it already was. So that would be the one thing that they could consider. Where do they have credibility in the law enforcement community, and also that bridges over into the communities that are most impacted? And I will say one other thing too. If you look at the protesters, and this is probably one of the most diverse protests that I've ever seen across diversity groups. So it's not so much a Black issue, but it's an issue that's being addressed by a number of different diverse groups who are outraged by some of these things. So the department has to spend time trying to develop its credibility, and they may not have a lot right now, so they have to lean on the credibility of those in law enforcement who already have that pre-existing credibility as a way of sort of getting into this. It's not so much a Black thing. I'll just quickly tell you a story about what happened in LAPD when, because I work at LAPD, right around the time that the Rodney King incident occurred. The Rampart District, which is the district where a lot of these riots were occurring, starting, they had a white precinct captain. And that white precinct captain had a relationship with the community. Chief Gates at the time thought it'd be a wise idea to remove that white precinct captain. Well, the community became outraged by that, and they replaced him with a Black precinct captain, and the community became outraged because they had a relationship with this white precinct captain. So Gates had to reverse himself and put back in the white precinct captain who had a great relationship with the community at that time.
All right, thank you. Maybe a follow-up question then, Dr. Johnson. Most Minneapolis police officers do not live within the city. What effect do you think this has on the policing practices?
It's huge. When I worked with Chicago PD, that was a big issue for them for a long time. And what they tried to do to eliminate that as a concern is they required all of their police officers to live within the city limits, which I think to some extent had a great effect on sort of sensitizing them to being in the community and being in the neighborhood, as opposed to being somewhat remote from the individuals that they were policing on a regular basis. So if that model was applied in Minneapolis, it might allow officers to come in with some kind of background in the communities where they have to patrol on a regular basis.
Thank you. So the next question is for Dr. Chambers. And the question is, what are the difficult conversations that we should be having in our medical and educational institutions with regard to racism?
That's a great question. I think, honestly, part of the challenge that we have when it comes to racism is about the prejudice, those preconceived notions that we have about others and their intentions. And I think in medical education, as well as in medicine, one of the things that we are not good at doing is really assessing people's motives. We have the non-compliant patient who doesn't show up or is difficult or maybe is rowdy or loud or something of the like, but They don't look like us, they don't behave like we do, and we're not willing to get below the surface to find out the why behind that. I think those are the kind of conversations we have to have and be okay with the answers, and be able to bring real solutions to the table. I think for students and those in the educational experience, I think it is also important to understand that if a student, for instance, is struggling, or a medical student is struggling and they don't look like you, you may assume that they have the same resources that you do, and they don't. They may be struggling with just paying their bills or getting textbooks or even having the resources they need to be successful. And we're not asking those questions. The assumption is that person's challenged, or they're not trying, or they're not doing the things they should do. It's easy to have superficial conversations about why somebody is not accomplishing or not doing what you expect them to do, or not behaving in a manner that you expect. But it can be so many other factors underlying that. And I think in medical education in particular, we don't dive deep enough to get those answers. I know it's a very kind of broad explanation, but I certainly think that that's what it's going to come down to, is asking those hard questions of one another about the why. Why are you doing this? Why are you struggling? Why are you failing? Why did you ask me that? And maybe if I use a personal experience, you know, I think a lot of people think that it comes in different experiences. All of us have very different experiences when it comes to racism. When I was a medical student, I went to a state school, and I remember an attending asking me how I got in, because I was an international student at the time. And my response to him was, actually, at first I was taken aback because I really didn't even understand. I was a foreigner and I didn't actually understand the concept until he explained to me that they were getting federal dollars from me. And after about a moment or so, I responded, I guess it must have been merit. And he stopped and he thought about it for a second, because as a student, there was not a question he asked me that I couldn't answer. And from that point on, we continued to talk, and I recognized I could have been angry with him, but it wasn't going to be helpful. What I needed to do was figure out why he believed this about all Black students, that we weren't qualified and that we weren't capable and we weren't equally qualified. And to that point, it gave me an opportunity to say and prove to him that we were. And I think, again, those are the interactions and the relationships I talk about. Building those relationships and overcoming the misconceptions are how we change the dialogue, how we change the expectations that people have of us.
Thank you, Dr. Chambers. So the next question is to all of the panelists. The question is, consciousness raising for white people about racism is important. What steps of action might be taken to concretely address the concerns with racism in law enforcement?
It's a great question. I'll start out with it. I know that in the academies, they do spend time talking about issues of bias, and that explicit bias is discussed and covered in policing. Whether or not that's the most effective way to achieve what they're trying to accomplish, I don't know. I have my own sort of mixed emotions and feelings about that training in terms of its ability to achieve what they're trying to achieve, but certainly a starting place. I also think, though, too, that the other piece of that requires the FTOs. By the way, the individual that was an FTO in policing is a field training officer. And when new recruits are sent into the community, they are assigned an FTO, a field training officer, who works with them and mentors them and guides them along the way. Well, this officer, former officer, I should say, that killed George Floyd was an FTO. And FTOs have responsibility for sort of communicating the culture in terms of practices. So we have to look at what happens to these new recruits once they get into that new culture, and who's responsible for guiding their attitudes and their behaviors when in the process of policing.
Other comments from the panelists?
No, I would just add that we are much more conscious today of the opportunity for healthcare professionals to be advocates and lobbyists, and to shape the public dialogue about not just police violence, but gun violence, and many other things. And that we are more aware than we've ever been that one's zip code is the most powerful predictor of their health and lifespan and all those kinds of things, that what we do in the healthcare system represents a relatively small impact on the overall life, especially of those who live in underserved areas and so on. And so I just broaden the question and say, this is a great insight and argument that at the national level and at local and regional levels, we need to be the voices who help the public in general understand the powerful impact of forces like violence of all kinds, racism, lack of education, all those things have on healthcare itself. We're advocates for patients, and we're very good at that on an individual basis, and I think we're growing to be really good at it in a larger fashion. But this is a great opportunity for the healthcare professionals among us to step forward as advocates.
Thank you, Father. Other comments? All right, so if not, the next question, and this is to all of the panelists. The question is, currently, students applying to medical school and residency are afraid to be vocal about their support for Black Lives Matter online out of fear of schools and programs that will not view these actions positively. How will our admissions committee and residency programs respond to student activists speaking out?
I don't mind giving my view on that.
Go ahead, Dr. Bell.
Sorry, my is messing up. So just having gone through that process and not yet being on the committee side, I will also echo that fear of how does it look when I am applying to residency and to medical schools. And I did recently have another medical student reach out to me for this exact same concern. And my advice, having already been in residency and being just about to finish, would be that I think one way that we as residents and as future attendings can help with this issue is by just kind of reiterating what I said with representation on faculty and staff with diversity in the faculty and staff to help alleviate some of this fear, and education of those who are not among the minority as well, because I think it was iterated in the comments that voices are also powerful that are not just coming from the Black community. And if we have faculty and staff members that are speaking out for minority students and minority residents, it does help alleviate some of that apprehension when it comes to being open about your beliefs on this matter.
And I want to jump in briefly and let everyone know that we received a comment from Joanne Porter on this question through the chat function. And I think her comment tells a lot about Creighton as an institution, because I think different institutions, different medical schools, and different residency programs would respond to students who are strong advocates or students who are activists in different ways. And Joanne Porter's response is that our residency programs would respond to activist students very positively.
Are there other comments from the panel?
Well, Mike Cavan jumped in as well, given his oversight role in admissions, and commented that I would love to see a student who advocates for just causes. So I think this says something perhaps about Creighton, and I think this would probably vary from institution to institution.
All right, thank you. All right, so the next question is to all of the panelists. And the question is, several universities have discontinued their contracts with local police departments due to continued history of police brutality. Does Creighton have such a contract? Does Creighton University have any such plans or views on this?
I'm not familiar with Creighton's contracts with the police department. Usually large police departments like Omaha in relation to Creighton do have some kind of an arrangement, and maybe contractual, where for certain large events or special events, they allow regular city police officers to be involved in policing certain areas and handling certain responsibilities. I don't know how that works here at Creighton, but I'm sure they do, because typically universities don't have the economic base to maintain the kind of police force necessary to cover those things on a 24/7 basis when they arise. So typically they'll contract or just have some kind of arrangement with the city's police departments or local police departments to do some of that. So I don't know. And I also don't know, too, if there are any clauses in those contracts that allow the university, if it has those contracts, to void them in the event that there's a concern about the reputation of the department. But since we're talking about contracts, I've often thought that organizations like the American Association of Medical Colleges should also be looking at those same questions and issues when they decide to hold their conferences, to determine if the cities and areas that they're considering holding those conferences have the police departments have some type of index that indicates their, I want to call it cross-cultural index, in terms of their connections with the community. So they would make decisions, that is, to not hold conferences in places where they view the police as being hostile to diverse communities.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Are there other comments?
I mean, I really struggle with the idea of defunding our police system. I think it could lead to, unfortunately, the reverse effect and actually disproportionately affect our communities. There are some good studies out of Harvard that suggest that when we go through episodes of this, of the like, or we compromise our police departments, what happens is then they are less likely to go into the communities of need. And so I think it actually can be harmful. I think that that's not the right mechanism or tool to fix or find solutions to this particular problem. And that's just my personal opinion about it.
Thank you.
I agree, and for a different reason. It'd be extremely difficult to create some kind of universal way of defunding police departments. What I would like to propose, which has been on the table and it has been used, but to a lesser extent, is to create stronger teeth in citizen review boards who actually have the authority and conversations with the chief to make recommendations and be able to review personnel files on officers that are involved in high-profile incidents to recommend termination or even higher levels of disciplinary action when those things occur. So defunding may not be possible, but there are a lot of other things that can be done to correct some of the unwanted behaviors. It's a culture. It's a blue culture that has been in existence for generations. And so it would take a lot to go about the task of trying to defund policing. And then what are you going to replace it with? There's no structure to replace it with. So it'd be very difficult. And it would be, like Dr. Chambers said, a very hard thing to kind of imagine what would happen in some of these communities if there is no presence of policing at all.
Thank you, Dr. Chambers and Dr. Johnson. So in the interest of time, I have one last question, and this was raised by many individuals in the chat function. What can I do to make a difference?
I think some beginning questions would be, how many times in your career have you immediately criticized or spoke out against racism of a colleague or an institution where you work? Maybe another question would be, what did you say to patients that have said to you that they don't want to work with any provider who's not white? What did I do when a person of color brought to my attention an issue of what they labeled as race-conscious behavior? So on a personal level, there are a lot of things that we all could do to kind of in our small way, make a contribution that deals with some of these issues that are percolating now.
I think that the emphasis, I'm sorry, Dr. Chambers, go ahead.
Oh, please do. So I guess for me, it's a bit of a challenge because I don't think you can force somebody to stop being racist. I think at the end of the day, the reality is either it's about a heart change. It really is. And in order to have that kind of change of heart, you really have to invest in other people. I think for those who want to do something and are not sure what to do, they need to figure out where they can invest into a community that doesn't look like theirs. Whether it's mentorship, whether it's finding an opportunity to build into or add value to somebody else who doesn't look like them, and taking the time to get to know them for who they are. I think that's the real opportunity there to change culture and change behaviors and really move past where we've been.
I think that the emphasis in recent years on unconscious bias training has laid a helpful foundation, because it's a recognition that all of us have these orientations toward the world, and that we are conscious of some of them some of the time, and some of them never, and some of them all the time, perhaps. But to take that as a starting point and to then in humility say, I will struggle with the way that I see other people in any kind of way that they might differ from me, potentially as a threat. It seems to be built in somehow to our humanity. And to step back and to say, that's an affliction. And I suffer with that affliction. And so I have to dedicate myself on a constant basis to being aware of every moment where I want to, in some way or another, overpower another person with my point of view, where I am only looking for a moment to intrude in the conversation rather than listening, and so on. It's so much of this, for me, comes down to the fundamental stuff that, you know, frankly, personally, I've been working at my whole life and still am not very good at. But nonetheless, there are these orientation issues to say, do I acknowledge at the start of each day that I'm a person with unconscious bias, and that I, as part of my contribution in life this day, I want to be more conscious, I want to catch myself, I want to retrace my steps, I want to apologize, I want to ask others how I can be better, and all of those things. The other orientation issue to me is, you know, this is a community of people who are intellectually curious. And that's a wonderful starting point. We can apply that to being humanly curious. Do we really believe that I am the poorer for not knowing other people in their diversity, in their complexity, in their richness, in their uniqueness, that I am impoverished forever, that I will always be the poorer for not having the experience deeply of other people, and especially of people who see things differently than me. And to sort of, you know, what if I were to go into every patient room or into every encounter with a patient and say, what can I learn about humanity from this person? You know, what can I learn about my shared humanity with this person? What can I learn about my individual humanity from this person? How can I be stretched to see more broadly, to be greater of heart, to be more magnanimous, to be more inclusive, to be more everything through every encounter with every person that I see? I'm clearly on board with Dr. Chambers' idea that this is about change of heart, which takes time and is a process, but it is something that we can attune ourselves to, and to say, that's part of my purpose every day, is to attune myself to this better.
Okay. On behalf, Dr. Bell, did you want to say something?
I will just briefly add a point.
Please go ahead.
I would echo what all the previous speakers had been saying, and how they articulated, and just giving my perspective on being a resident and close to the students. I would advocate for leaders and faculty and staff in leadership position to just be open to the voices of residents and medical students that do bring up such topics that they are experiencing racism on a daily basis. And although we are slowly progressing towards higher levels and obtaining positions of power as we graduate from residency and become attendings, we may not have as powerful of voices at this time as we would like. So having a liaison who is there and will speak out and use their voice means that much more to those that have to deal with it daily when it comes to facing things from colleagues or things from patients. It is, I think, imperative that we have leaders who are willing to do that for us. And I'm proud to say that I have had leaders do it for me. And so I think that that is just one thing that I wanted to add.
I want to, on behalf of the entire family of the Creighton University School of Medicine, first thank Dean Dunley and Dr. Johnson for taking the initiative really to convene the entire family of our school, faculty, residents, fellows, students, staff, to gather together and start a conversation again about these topics of racism, of the lack of diversity, even within our institutions, and the need to build a more inclusive culture for everybody. I want to thank the panelists who spoke, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Chambers, Dr. Bell, and Father Clifton, for offering their remarks and their insight and their experience that helps inform this conversation. And I also want to thank all of the attendees who took time out to participate in this, and those who asked questions. We were only able to answer and respond to a fraction of the questions that were addressed, and we'll work with Dr. Johnson to determine how we may continue to be able to carry this conversation forward and maybe continue responding to some of the concerns raised by attendees that did not get addressed in the discussion. So I think this was an important step for our school to convene a meeting like this and to start this conversation. And I look forward to continuing it in the future. On behalf of the school, thank you all very much.